I get really mad when my brother hits me a lot.
I don't like it when you say you don't want to play with me.
When I'm mad, my brain can get a headache and it can start hurting.
Your blood keeps pumping because you're like really mad. And you start to get sweaty because you're getting really, really mad. And then when you start getting really mad, you turn red.
When your body can't really control yourself, mad just takes over your body.
I just get out of control.
It's kind of like if you had a jar and then the jar would be your brain and then you put glitter in the jar and that would be how you would feel like. If you shook up the jar and the glitter went everywhere, that would be how your mind looks. And it's like spinning around and then you don't have any time to think.
And you sometimes punch stuff and people when you don't really mean it.
When I get angry, I feel it in my heart.
I really don't like when I get angry. The amygdala really reacts, but the prefrontal cortex tries to keep it down. When I feel like I want to, get really angry and yell, I just sometimes, take deep breaths. First you find a place where you can be alone, then you find some way to relax and calm down.
When I need to calm down, I take deep breaths.
I breathe in through my nose. Sometimes I close my eyes or just take deep breaths.
It's calming down, it's not moving. It's slowing down and then it stops. And the heart plumps slow and then it goes into your brain.
It's like all the sparkles are at the bottom of your brain.
My brain slows down and then I feel more calm and then I'm ready to speak to that person.
Let's take a few minutes of quiet time, shall we? I'll ring the bell once at the beginning, 3 times at the end. Taking this opportunity to arrive, to settle in, to find a seat in a posture that serves us well. Spine erect, neck long, yet relaxed, feet on the floor, establishing our foundation. Still, steady, balanced. And then bringing the attention to the breath. The in-breath and the out-breath. Breathing in and breathing out. Simply allowing the breath to breathe. Noticing how the breath on its own is steady, it's easy, rhythmic, natural. So paying attention to the breath, spending time with the breath. Perhaps noticing the coolness of the air coming in and the warmness of the air going out. Cool coming in and warm going out. The felt experience of the breath, in and out. Nowhere to go, nothing to do. Just breathe. Steady, easy, calm. Settling into the stillness. Calm, yet awake. Knowing that any time, any place when we're stressed or troubled, when the mind is wandering, when we need it right here with us now, we can always come back to the breath. The breath is always present, always now. The steady, easy flow of the breath. Breathing in and breathing out. Before we move on, are there any thoughts, reflections, either on the video or the quiet time that we just shared together? Please.
I guess when I watched it, it made me think back to my years of teaching, and wish I would have had the knowledge and the skill to share those ideas and those practices with students, especially the students I dealt with severe behavior and emotional problems. And then also thinking about how do you, once you incorporate it in your life, how do you share that with others? I know you're sharing it this way, but I don't know.
It was a piece on the news talking about road rages, and they interviewed one of the taxi drivers in New York, which is awful. He said the best thing is I just breathe.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do anything, I just breathe.
I like the imagery of the sparkles in the water, and it was very relaxing to me at the end to see the sparkles just start to fall. I really connected with that.
Yeah.
All of this, I think sometimes we take just breathing for granted. And I work in residential. We see a lot of traumatized kids. and they don't know that breathing piece, and so it's just reaction, where it's taking a step back and teaching them how to breathe and how to be mindful and how they feel and mindful of where they're at. And so it's definitely important and definitely something that I think should be taught to children young to be aware of. Your heart rate's going up, you're upset, well, what can you do to take a step back and just breathe and relax yourself and get your thoughts together.
Yeah, so young, and they're already aware of their bodies, sensations in their body, of their emotions, their thoughts. At such a young age.
And I think sometimes they're aware of where they're at when they're really high, but they're not aware of the slow climb, or even such a fast climb. It's like from 0 to 60, and they're not aware of the slow climb, the incline up, and they're not aware of how to slowly and quickly bring it back down. And so being mindful is definitely a way to.
Yeah, thank you.
I just was absolutely delighted in hearing the children talk about the amygdala and the neocortex. And when I use it with some of my small children in the deep breathing, they put their hand on their tummy. They want to feel that go in and out. And so it's good, and it has been helpful.
Any other thoughts before we move on? Yeah, go ahead.
The visual aspect is, as far as I know, pretty good proven technique. It's funny that you mentioned the sparkles in the water. I volunteer at a children's bereavement camp over the summer, and that's one of the activities that they do. Is they have a little water bottle, and they kind of, one of the techniques when they're a little angry, they can get a little of that energy out, but then they walk. And it works for many of them. I know for me, just walking to work and back, deliberately just kind of putting aside the iPod and just focusing on maybe snow falling or just some element of nature. I find visually that can work as well.
What excites me personally and professionally as an educator is the deep learning. They understand this in terms of their own experience, in their bodies, their feelings, their thoughts, the way in which their minds work, and they also understand the cognitive piece, the science, the explanation. It's just a wonderful thing. Well, we're gonna transition here. So what I would like you to do is I am going to ask you to evaluate your critical thinking. Okay, and what you're going to do is you're going to give yourself a number between 1 and 10. 10 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. And so what do you think of your critical thinking? Would you give yourself a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever that is? Now, you can write that down or just remember that because what's going to happen is when we're done today, I'm going to ask you that question again. And I want to see if you go up or down with that number. Traditionally, when we think about critical thinking, it has to do with things like fallacies and what makes a good argument and that kind of thing. And it all goes way back to the ancient Greeks and with the syllogism. And that's really been the currency for many, many years. But about 25 years ago, Richard Paul came up with a model of critical thinking that was very different. And rather than just focusing on reason and logic as previous models did, his was much more inclusive, much more comprehensive, and included reasoning. But reasoning and logic were just one piece of this much larger model. And so it was very revolutionary, and it's still kind of cutting edge even today. But now we can talk about critical thinking in terms of mindfulness, because mindfulness is a whole new way of looking at critical thinking. What we're doing with mindfulness is we are creating a space where we're creating a space in which we can observe our thinking. We can have a perspective on our thinking that is different than if we're just right in the middle of it. Okay? And so that's what makes this kind of unique. Mindfulness gives us that pause, that moment to where we can notice our experience and not be totally caught up in it. And so that gives us a perspective on our thinking that doesn't just happen when we're just thinking alone. So what we're going to do today is we're going to begin the process of looking how we can use mindfulness to enhance our critical thinking and how we can combine that with the Richard Paul model in critical thinking. Now that model has a lot of history here at Ferris. A number of years ago, when Bill Cederberg was the president, one of the committees or one of the initiatives they had was the Knowledge Worker Initiative, which became the Critical Thinking Initiative. And I was the co-chair of that committee at the time. The other was Betty Stolarik. Now, some of you may know Betty. Many, many years ago, Betty, along with some other Langlook faculty, had a real interest in critical thinking. And they had discovered Richard Paul. And Betty went all the way out to California to take his week-long intensive. Now, this is a big deal for Betty because Betty doesn't fly. Okay, so she drove all the way there and all the way back to be a part of this. But they continued to do things there. In fact, they had brought Richard Paul in. And as the co-chair of the committee, I had the opportunity to meet him while he was there. And a very impressive man. Well, I had the opportunity to go to that very same training it was amazing. You know, I was a convert. And the following year, there was a whole bunch of faculty that got to go to that training. And that was the last year that they did that. But out of that, we started a Critical Thinking Institute, and we were very active for a while. We had conferences, and we'd bring people in from around the state, and it was really kind of exciting. But that kind of tapered off. But a colleague of mine and myself, Donna Smith, got really excited about this and did a lot of learning communities through the Faculty Center. And we developed a certification process. And the idea was at the end of that three-phase process that you would be able to do what we are doing. And we had some very successful graduates. One who is sitting is in this room right here. And she and her partner, I saw them when they did their final piece, and it was incredible. It was incredible. You did a marvelous job. And I still have those goofy-looking bloodshot glasses that you used in the training. Okay, so critical thinking has some history here using the Richard Paul model. So what I'm going to do today, oh, I know I forgot one piece. There is a researcher in mindfulness at Harvard named Susan Langer, and she's been studying mindfulness for over 40 years. And she points out that when we practice mindfulness, even if it's not meditation, but if we just choose to be mindful, that there are certain kinds of things that begin to happen. What happens is we get better at being able to take other people's perspectives. Okay? What we do is we develop new categories and new ways of looking at things. We begin to learn more about ourselves. And all of this is consistent with the other track of mindfulness research that's going on. But she also said, and I do have the piece, and I'll provide you the link to it, where she talks about mindfulness as being, she calls, a superordinate variable. And what she means is that whenever you're doing anything, regardless of what it is, you're either mindless or mindful. It's one or the other. Okay? And so by superordinate variables, she's talking about it as being a precondition. Okay? It's kind of there before anything else you do. It's the context in which you do it. So we can choose to do it mindfully or go for the default, which is mindlessly. And that's our default position. Our default is mindlessness. That's our default. And so we have to make that choice to be mindful, beginning with the recognition that, well, am I mindless or mindful right now? And each and every time we ask that question, guess what? We have just made the decision to be mindful. So she talks about it as being a superordinate variable. So if we're going to do this thing called critical thinking, this Richard Paul model, which is huge and terrific, what if we do it in a mindful way? What if we bring those two elements together? It would seem on the face of it that we'd have a much richer experience. And so that's kind of where we're headed today. And so that means that a little bit of this, I suppose you might call it didactic, but I do need to expose you to Richard Paul's model. What made his model unique was he said that whenever we do any kind of thinking, and this is true of any kind of communication, whether it's interpersonal communication thinking, whether it's interpersonal communication between people, whether it's oral communication or written communication, okay, all of this applies. And what he said is that in any thinking, in any communication, there are certain parts, that all communication, all thinking has certain parts, okay, and that all of these can be evaluated by standards. There's certain standards that we can use to improve our use of each and every one of those parts. So basically what he did is he identified 8 parts, okay, and he identified 9 standards. And so what that means is I can identify the whole message using those standards, or I can identify each of those parts using each of those 9 standards. So there's unlimited possibilities. But what it is, it's a wonderful tool for dissecting our thinking, for really beginning to look at it in ways that open up possibilities that didn't exist. Because now we're saying, oh my gosh, that's part of the communication. That's part of communication. I've been ignoring that. I've been ignoring that. I didn't know that was there. And so it does bring a whole new level of awareness. What I wanted to quickly show you, the article I was talking about with Susan Langer, and Mindfulness in the Age of Complexity. I'll send you the link to this. It's really, really quite fascinating. Okay, these are the elements of thought. So what we're saying that anytime there's a thought or anytime there's a communication, that all of these elements are there. Okay. So when we communicate, for example, there is a purpose. Okay? There's an intention. And one of the standards that is applied to this is clarity. In fact, Richard Paul says that of all the standards, probably clarity is the most important. And I know when I teach in my communication class, I probably emphasize clarity more than anything else. And so it's all about how can we get clarity in this communication. So for example, I may have a certain intention or purpose, okay, in doing what I'm doing. But of course I have my perception, my understanding of that purpose. And so I communicate that to you in language and words, and you on your end take that information and then have your perception of what my purpose is, stated or unstated. Okay. But I may or may not understand it correctly, right? So in communication we talk about things about the importance of feedback. We know that one-way communication is pretty ineffective. We know back two-way communication is better but still not good enough. But if we go back and forth 3 or 4 times, well, this is what I want to do. So what you want to do is this. Yeah, I want to do this, but I want, but more along those lines. So what you want to do. So 3 or 4 rounds of that, we probably understand each other, right? Mm-hmm. But isn't it interesting how little time we take to actually do that? We do a lot of assuming, and assuming gets us in a lot of trouble. So that's just one example. But now we want to get to the more interesting stuff. This is the kinds of things that we would normally think about. But what we don't normally think about is assumptions, implications and consequences, and points of view. Let's take the point of view. Whenever we have people in any kind of communication situation, we have different points of view, right? And so I may be coming from a frame of reference, a point of view that where I'm talking about something, it has this kind of meaning for me, and it has that kind of meaning for you, okay? Moreover, we don't do a very good job of taking the other person's point of view. But I'll give you a real quick example. I remember when I was, if you were to say the word dog, just the word dog, the denotative method would be the dictionary definition. We could all agree on it. But the connotative meaning is very personal, as is all communication, all right? Well, if you say the word dog, for you, it might be that fuzzy little chihuahua that you have at your house. They're not fuzzy, are they? To me, a chihuahua is just a noisy little yapping dog. Oh, I just alienated some people, didn't I? Okay. But actually, when I was young, when I was about 5 or 6, I was attacked by a collie viciously, and I ended up having to be hospitalized. And for many years, I was a runner. And I ran in places with dogs. And I've had dogs chase me. I've had dogs bite me. Okay? And so when you say dog, that conjures up a lot of stuff for me. So my point of view, my frame of reference is very, very different. So the point of all this is, when we begin to look at the communication and we begin to look at the parts, one of the things we need to look at is the point of view. When communicating with someone, do we look at the various points of view that are at play? My point of view, your point of view, and so on. Another interesting one is implications and consequences. Implications and consequences. Consequences are the things we want to happen as a result of this communication. So we put a plan into place, and this is the things we want to happen. Okay? And I still remember quite well when George Bush, President Bush, got on that carrier and said, "We've won the war." Okay? Well, in terms of the consequences, in terms of what they had hoped would happen on the short term, they could make that claim. But look at the implications of that. Look what has happened, what it has led to. Now, we can't say that that single war caused all of this, but clearly there are things that happened that were totally unintended, totally unexpected, but could have been anticipated if they had taken the time to really consider the implications. But when we're blind in our ambition, when we're closed-minded, when we're not mindful, then we can ignore the consequences of our behavior. So again, when we communicate in any situation, we're not only considering what we hope to gain, but perhaps more importantly, what might happen. Taking the time to be mindful about the implications. And the final one is assumptions. And I got to tell you, in my classes, we spend an awful lot of time talking about assumptions, because the fact of the matter is we make a lot of our decisions based on assuming. Assuming that's what they think, that's what they feel, assuming that that's what their circumstances is, assuming that they understand me, assuming, and what is lacking is information. What is lacking is information. So the reason I bring these things up is, if you look at Susan Langer's research in particular, she talks about how by being mindful, we naturally become more aware of those. Why? Because the way mindfulness works is, I first of all become aware of me. I become more aware of my assumptions. I become more aware of my own frame of reference. I gain clarity into my insides, which then provides a lens for seeing other people more clearly. You know, I can only be as good in my communication with others, my understanding of others, as I am with myself. Now, maybe you don't buy that. Maybe you don't buy that. But the kind of clarity I have into my own experience is going to determine to a large extent the clarity I have into others' experience. And it's really interesting. The research in mindfulness, particularly this work that's been done by Richard Davidson out of the University of Wisconsin, he's written a great book called The Emotional Life of the Brain. Okay? And it's an easy read. But what he has done is he's shown the brain research has identified places in the brain where there's certain kinds of mindfulness activity going on. And he developed what he called an emotional style inventory. And I used that last year on one of these Lunch and Learn series. But for example, one of the qualities it develops in this emotional styles is we develop this sensitivity to context, okay, where we can read the situation, okay. We develop the ability to be able to read people, to develop this emotional intelligence, okay, just by being mindful. We develop the ability to be resilient and bounce back from strong emotion. And it can go on and on and on. So these are qualities that we develop through mindfulness. And notice some of them are directed towards the other, and some are directed to the self. And it's interesting, if you look at the research on compassion, we know that as people become more self-compassionate, they become more naturally compassionate and empathic towards others. Because if I can touch my own suffering, my own stress, my own discomfort, just touch it, just be with it, then that enables me to extend that same thing to others. So mindfulness is really an inside job. It's really an inside job. So the more I'm mindful of what I'm doing, the better I will be at what I'm doing. So great, but what if we include something like this in this? What if we actually were to say, okay, I'm going to talk to my wife now, and that is, as you know, that is both the most satisfying and most challenging relationship, although the research shows that the most challenging relationship is the mother-daughter relationship. And I forget the name of the book, but there's a great book that came out a couple of years ago, and I believe that's true. I listened to my wife with her daughter. I'm absolutely convinced of it. It's you know, guys, we get in a, you know, we're talking and stuff. It's kind of steady. You listen to a mother-daughter. This is all anecdotal now, okay? And it's like, one moment they're at each other's throats, the next month they're loving each other. I mean, in a 10-minute period, they can go through a lot of stuff. That would wear me out, okay? But there's such complexity and richness to that relationship, So the idea here is then that we can have tools and we can use these to make us better critical thinkers. I would like you to take a look at the standards. Now, even if you ignore the elements, even if you ignore the elements, you will get a lot of mileage out of these standards. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move down to the big picture here. And I want to leave enough time for you to... But here we go. This is the idea. You have these elements, and you apply these standards. You have clarity, accuracy, relevance, logicalness, precision, significance, completeness, fairness, and depth. Now, an interesting aside, in the book, the Little Miniature Guide to Critical Thinking, at one place in the book they list 9 standards, and here they list 10. And I certainly wasn't the first one to point that out to them, but they never made that change. But you know, I just noticed something today, or yesterday. They had the 9, and then in this box they have 10. Notice completeness is the 10th. When they put in completeness, they completed it, didn't they? But I'll give you an idea how this works. What this says, when I'm communicating with someone, I ask myself, am I clear? Am I accurate? Is this correct? Am I precise? Did I provide enough details? Did I zero in enough? Another one is breadth. Did I cover everything I needed to cover? Depth. Did I go deep enough? Okay, logic. Is it reasonable? Does it make sense? Is it coherent? Does it flow? Another one of them is, let's see. Oh, yes, relevance and significance. Relevance, does it relate? But significance asks, are we getting at the most significant thing? Are we getting at the most important thing? And finally, is it fair? And I don't mean fair and balanced, okay? What we're really talking about here, more importantly, is recognizing my own biases, recognizing my own frame of reference, okay, and how that influences me in this moment. How this influences me in this moment. Recognizing that I am biased, I do have a perspective, okay? That's what we're talking about, fairness. And that's pretty high-level stuff. You know, to be able to just take that moment and go, okay, what's at play here with me? What's influencing me? And that's where the mindfulness can be really helpful. I don't think it's overstating it to say that if we're mindful, if we're really mindful, then we have an inclination towards fairness. But if we're closed-minded or blind, or we're in patterns of reactivity, then we can be unfair. All right. So that's quite a bit of information, but I think you get the gist of it, right? So I want to ask you again, and we will be recycling this. I'll be sending this out to you. But I asked you at the beginning whether you were a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or maybe a 10. I'm going to ask you again. Knowing what you do now, would you give yourself the same number? A different number? Higher? Lower? Because we're talking about critical thinking as having to do something with mindfulness, and we're talking about it having to do something with this. So where do you think? You higher or lower?
When you ask the question, critical thinking, immediately I think, okay, I'm a good critical thinker. But then when you tied in the mindfulness part, I had to rethink that. I would have given myself an 8 probably to begin with, but am I mindful about what I do? No. I really think that I'm not, that I'm more reactive. So I'd have to bring that down to like a 5 or lower maybe sometimes. So it's tying those together that change my perception.
Yeah, yeah. Somebody else, higher or lower? Or about the same? How about somebody way back over there? Higher or lower?
I went higher, but after reading this, but upon thinking about my conversation that I had with my husband on the phone last night, I think I dropped it pretty low.
Yeah, I guess if we do this on a situational basis, there's going to be a lot of variability, isn't it? Yeah. Isn't it funny how it works? It seems like in the most challenging, often the most important ones, it's like it's, yeah.
So I would say the same thing, but obviously in conversations with my daughters, I'm probably like a 2.
That's right. I'm thinking I'm negative ways.
Yeah, isn't that interesting when we're in situations that are emotionally charged? Yeah, then there's that kind of that activating system, and the body kicks in. Those chemicals are flowing, and there's probably some other stuff, maybe some anxiety, some fear, but there's that, yeah, emotionally charged stuff is challenging for sure. But look at these kids. Amazing. Yes?
Well, this just brings to mind this one part of me that I'm really wrestling with as an adult, and that is the, if I become emotional, I try as I might, I'm like trying really hard. It's almost as if somebody just ripped all the communication abilities right out of me. And I'm sitting there, I know that I could really focus in and hone in on what it is I'm trying to communicate right now. The emotions just possess me. You know, like
so,
I can't say what I want.
What would those, and that's in your situation, what would those what would those kids do?
They would have to take a moment.
They'd breathe. They'd take a moment to breathe. Yeah. But I understand that it's like, boy, it's like I want to get it out there now. Yeah. To heck with the breath. Yeah, I found that doesn't work well with conflict. I had an issue the other day. Well, it's a few weeks ago. My wife was making suggestions over the phone. As I mentioned, she lives and works in Denver, and she was talking about some employment possibilities in Denver for the summer. And I found myself arguing with her, and I got so upset that I hung up on her. And that was a bad move, and I knew it. And but it was emotionally charged, man. I was reactive, and so she called me back and let me know what she thought, and pointed out that she was trying to be helpful. And I texted her back and said, honey, I love you. And I said, but I can't really talk about it now. And I waited till I was clear-headed the next day. And once I had my emotions calmed and I could be mindful, have clarity, I made an amends, and I saw she was well-intended. But at the time, that wasn't my experience. Okay, I needed that space. So I needed to take a breath then, but I didn't. But I was smart enough to realize this can't continue. I got to wait until I can. So that was a mindful choice. But yeah. Mindfulness isn't about doing it perfectly. It's about deciding to start up all over again. So thanks for sharing that. We're about 5 minutes left. Is there any other thoughts, experience? Anybody go up or down on the ratings? Remain the same? I like to pick on students, and we have a few students in the room, so yeah.
I think mine went down just because of assumptions. I know as I assume a lot.
Yeah. And it's great when we can get that awareness. It's like, yeah, I do that with assumptions. So maybe, just maybe with that new awareness, I'll be a little more mindful of that next time around. And that's how this tool is useful. If it can bring a new awareness, then the next time we're mindful, we'll be more sensitive to that. It's kind of like the way education works, huh? Yes?
Mine went down. But as you were talking about these standards and these elements, I was thinking about some conversations that I've had with my younger sibling, and especially my younger sister. She's, a junior in high school. She's at that age where it's like hell, And I have found myself in conversations preaching these things to her, these ideals to her, without even knowing what they really are linked to. And that I tell her that, these are things I'm still practicing, Being an adult is hard, and getting to that stage where you have to make all these decisions is very hard. And you look up to me and everything, but you have to know I'm still working on all these things too. So it's gonna take some time, honey, and you just gotta work through it. And so it's just funny to see that this being part of mindfulness.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts? Anybody go up? Anybody go up? Okay. Jody? I don't know if I want to share. We're a friendly group.
One of the things that I've started doing at work, I see a lot of conflict. Things come in and where people are emotionally charged, and I've learned to just sit back and just listen openly, not validate what they're saying, but let people vent a little bit. And it gives me an opportunity as I'm listening, to them to remain calm and try to find the best approach to help somebody that is emotionally charged about something, and get them thinking about the standards when they're making decisions.
So you've made it your job to listen and not necessarily to take sides or even necessarily mediate. So when you're in that listening mode, there's a different kind of awareness that comes with just paying attention, isn't there? Yeah.
When you notice yourself feeling a certain emotion, it is important to take a moment and say, well, why am I feeling like that? And what can I do to get rid of that bad feeling? You know, what action do I need to take instead of just keeping it inside and letting things build?
Thank you. Well, that's it for today, and I look forward to seeing you next week. We'll pick up where we left off. We're transitioning to how can we do this in groups. It could be the family. Okay, see you then.